Thank you everyone for joining today. The topic of today's session is very important and very near to my heart. We're going to talk about data tiering for Cloud Volumes ONTAP. So a little bit about me before we start. My name is John DeMasi. I'm a technical customer success program manager here at NetApp, and my specialization is Cloud Volumes ONTAP. I love the product, and I'm sure I've spoken with many of you on this call about it. So without further ado, let's talk about some data tiering. So here's the agenda I have for today's session. It's going to be a brief lecture. Oh, sounds a little bit pompous to call it a lecture, but I'm going to call it a lecture. And then we're going to do a demonstration where I'll show you some of this stuff in a live environment. I would like to give myself a quick caveat. I'm sure a lot of you can relate. Unfortunately, our demo systems that I typically use to demonstrate this stuff went down earlier today, a few hours before this call, and they came back online at about 1:55. So I'm really happy they're back online and that I'll be able to demonstrate. Just in advance, bear with me if anything doesn't work. I didn't really have a chance to go through and validate like I would normally before. But then again, I'm an expert, so I'm sure it'll be fine. Anyway, so today's session is intended for Cloud Volumes ONTAP customers who want to know more about data tiering and how it can save a lot of money, quite honestly, as far as your operational costs for Cloud Volumes ONTAP. We're going to start off by just talking about what data tiering is at a high level. I'll talk about the capacity tiers that you can utilize in both AWS and Azure. We'll talk about the various tiering policies that Cloud Volumes ONTAP supports. I'll go into a couple of things that you should really know. And then we'll go into the aforementioned demonstration that will hopefully go flawlessly. All right, sweet. So what is data tiering? That's a great question. So if you've worked with NetApp in the past and you have NetApp products besides Cloud Volumes ONTAP, I'm sure you are familiar with the concept of a fabric pool. That's actually exactly what data tiering is. It's based on fabric pool technology. And yeah, I mean, the whole idea of data tiering is that you're combining a performance tier and a capacity tier into a single storage pool that you can manage data between seamlessly. To just kind of restate that, the idea here is that we want to help you store your data that's in the cloud in the cheapest way possible. So typically when you look at AWS or Azure storage, they're really divided into two categories. There's block storage devices that are really just analogous to hard drives. And then there's object storage that typically takes the form of buckets, and you can just throw as much data into it as you want, right? So block storage devices are great for hot data. They're what you really need to run applications or run operating systems. And then object storage is great for just storing files. It's a lot cheaper than block storage, and it just makes perfect sense for data that you are not immediately going to be accessing as part of an application, etc. Put that in object storage because it's cheaper. By the way this works is that your users actually can't tell where the data is sitting. They would access your CIF shares, your NFS shares, whatever you're provisioning using Cloud Volumes ONTAP, as they would normally. And then hidden from their view, Cloud Volumes ONTAP knows whether to bring data into the performance tier, move data to the capacity tier, etc. The user doesn't know any better. You, as the admin, know that you're saving money, and that's really all that matters. Cool. So again, what is data tiering? Kind of already explained it, but the idea here is we're automatically moving data between a performance tier of elastic block storage in AWS or locally redundant storage in Azure, and in a capacity tier, which would be S3 in AWS or Blob in Azure. Now, the way the data moves is going to depend on the tiering policy that you choose on a particular volume, and we're going to go into that a little bit later. But the idea here is that by using data tiering, we're using your disk-based aggregates, which are expensive in the most efficient way possible. We're only using them for data that really requires a disk-based aggregate, right? When we do data tiering, we're actually going to be using one bucket per working environment, and that does include HA deployments in AWS. And like I said, users access data in the capacity tier as they would normally. They actually don't even know it's been tiered into object storage, which is great. So the whole point of data tiering is to save money. It makes sense to talk for a moment about how storage for Cloud Volumes ONTAP is priced. So hopefully everybody who's on the call and uses this product knows that there are three components to the total cost of ownership of Cloud Volumes ONTAP. There's your NetApp licensing cost, which you are either covering with a BYOL license or you're paying through the AWS or Azure Marketplace. Then there's a compute cost based on the type of EC2 instance or VM that you're using and the amount of time that you let that run. The third element of the total cost of ownership is storage, of course, and that's where data tiering can save you money. So the way you're charged for storage for Cloud Volumes ONTAP, it's really just two elements. First of all, the number and type of LRS or EBS disks that you have provisioned into aggregates. And by the way, if you're not sure how many LRS or EBS disks you have provisioned into aggregates, there's actually a specific menu for that in Cloud Manager called the Advanced Allocation menu. I'll be showing that to you during the demo. And by the way, you're going to get these slides so you can check out the links, etc. I like to link to documentation whenever I can. Anyway, going back to the main topic, the way that you are charged for storage, Cloud Volumes ONTAP, it's the number and type of LRS or EBS disks that you've got provisioned into aggregates, and then the amount of S3 or blob storage that you utilize. So the amount of object storage, S3 blob, that you're using is going to depend on how much you're tiering. This can vary day to day, minute by minute. It's not like a disk where you add it into an aggregate and then just get charged for it as long as it's provisioned. And then, of course, the thing we all really care about here is the fact that S3 blob storage, or S3 or blob storage, it's a lot cheaper than paying for EBS or LRS. And I just give you an example here. I checked out the pricing in AWS in the East 1 region today. If you wanted to provision 1 gigabyte of GP2 EBS, that's their standard SSD drive, that'll be 10 cents per gigabyte a month versus S3 standard object storage, which is, I guess that's about a quarter of a cent, or 2.3 cents. Long day today with that lab outage. You might be able to tell I'm a little out of it. Anyway, another key thing, and this is huge if you are doing an HA deployment in AWS, both of your nodes tier to a single bucket. So as you probably know, when you do an HA deployment in AWS, you have a fully redundant environment. Everything is duplicated, including your EBS disks. When you use data tiering in AWS on an HA deployment, and you tier, switch out 2 EBS disks for 1 bucket, the savings are significant. It becomes more like a sixth of the cost, which is awesome. And by the way, if anybody has any questions, please feel free to use the chat window. Jill, is that how we do it, or do we have the Q&A thing on this?
This is just the plain old chat window, so super easy to use.
All right, sweet. Yeah, if anybody has any questions as I'm speaking, feel free to pop them into the chat. I think this part was probably the part that we all already knew, and I've already spent too much time on it. But anyway, let's continue. All right, cool. So we talked about what data tiering is, right? It's managing data between a performance tier and a capacity tier. Let's talk about the different capacity tiers that you can choose from. So first of all, it's really important to know that you get one capacity tier per working environment. And if you aren't familiar with the term working environment, that just means per system, per node, whatever, per license is probably the best way to think of it. And remember, that's important because it's one bucket per working environment. So clearly that one bucket can only be one kind of storage. Cool. So for AWS users, these are your options: S3 standard, S3 standard infrequent access, S3 one zone infrequent access, and then intelligent tiering, which is very cool. Azure is a little simpler. It's blob, and you can choose between hot or cool. So some things to know about these different targets, right? Generally speaking, hot targets. So that would be things like S3 standard or blob hot are going to have a higher storage cost. So a higher cost per gigabyte month. But in the event that you need to retrieve that data from object storage, your access cost is going to be lower. On the flip side, cooler targets, so blob cool, S3 infrequent access, they're going to have a lower storage cost. So you're going to pay less per gigabyte per month to keep your data in there. But in the event that you ever need to access your data, it's going to cost you more. So clearly, depending on your workload, you'll have to make that judgment about whether it makes more sense to pay more for storage and then pay less in the event that you need it versus I'm never going to touch this data and I just want to store it as cheaply as possible, which would make a cool target a great choice for you. I'm going to go ahead and preempt a question that comes up every single time I talk about data tiering. Unfortunately, today we do not support archive storage. So we are unable to help you tier to Glacier or to Blob Archive in Azure. Sorry about that. I'm not sure if that's something we'll be able to do. A big issue with that is just the really slow access time from archive storage. We hear about it a lot. We know there's a lot of people interested in it. Unfortunately, it's not something we support today, and I'm not really sure if we will in the near future. Cool, I'll pause here and see if anything comes through in the chat. Any questions about capacity tiers? This just kind of is what it is. All right, great. So those are the capacity tiers that we support. You choose one per working environment, so that's an important choice. Let's talk about tiering policies. These are a little bit more flexible. You set your tiering policies at the volume level. So different volumes in the same working environment can have different tiering policies. That's perfectly fine, and that's probably the right way to use this feature. So I'm going to talk about all three tiering policies in detail. This is really important. This is probably the most important part of the presentation today. At a high level, you can tier snapshots only, you could tier cold data and snapshots, or you could throw everything you got into the capacity tier if you want. An important note that impacts the snapshots only and auto tiering policies, which again, I'm going to go into detail on in a second. Just keep in mind, those policies don't begin to move data into the capacity tier until what we call the tiering fullness threshold is met. So that is by default 50% of the aggregate capacity. And if you're running ONTAP 9.5 or, well, it's kind of silly to say or later because that's the latest, but starting in 9.5, you can change that percentage. I also get a lot of questions about this. The way I think about it is, if you have disks in an aggregate that are already provisioned, it makes sense to use them, right? Why would you put data into your capacity tier if there's tons of space in an aggregate that you're already paying for, right? So that's the reason why that's in place. If you want to tier a ton of data, my recommendation is keep your aggregate really small, which is super helpful anyway, because that just makes everything cheaper. I do see that we have a question about, will there be a minimum percentage in the next release? There's actually a minimum percentage today. I forget what it is. I want to say it's 10%. I'll have to double check that, but it's something in that ballpark. Cool. Hope that's helpful. Now we're going to talk about each of these tiering policies in a little bit more detail. Like I said, this is really the meat of the presentation. Understanding these tiering policies is really the key to using this feature effectively. Cool. So we'll start off by talking about snapshots only. This one's pretty straightforward. The idea here is that we're just going to be tiering snapshots that you probably don't need to your capacity tier. By default, the cooling period is 2 days. So once a snapshot becomes 2 days old, assuming that your aggregate is the correct fullness level, that snapshot will just shoot over to the capacity tier. And like I said, the default cooling period is 2 days. You can change this. The range is 2 to 63 days, and you'll actually use the tiering minimum cooling days parameter, and you can use that in conjunction with the volume create or volume modify commands. By the way, this is kind of implied, but you can only change the cooling period by connecting to the ONTAP CLI. There's no way to do this in the interface currently. Anyway, so the snapshots only tiering policy is a great choice for workloads where there are either no cold data or where retrieval latency would be unacceptable. I'm going to talk about that a little bit later in the presentation, but do just keep in mind that when you're moving data from the capacity tier to the performance tier, it's going to add a little bit of latency. I don't think most customers find it to be a big deal, but if you've got a workload that's requires crazy fast performance, and it'd be a problem if data that somehow ends up in the capacity tier is impacted by some latency, stick with snapshots only. You probably just don't really want to be tiering data for workloads like that. Cool. So like I said, that one's fairly straightforward. The next tiering policy option is the auto tiering policy. This is a good choice, I think, for a lot of people, and this is the one that I usually recommend. The auto tiering policy tiers snapshots and cold data to the capacity tier after the cooling period has passed. So it's basically snapshots only, except we're also going to tier cold data from your file system. So by default, data will start to move from the performance tier to the capacity tier after it is cooled off for 31 days. That's the default. Like I said, you could change this 2 to 63 days. That's your choice. And again, keep in mind with this tiering policy that, again, the aggregate fullness threshold must be met. So data will not start to move to the capacity tier until, by default, your aggregate is 50% full. Like I said, this is a good choice for a lot of people. If you have a workload where some of your data is hot and some of your data is cold, the Katy Perry workload, if you would, this is probably a good choice. It'll just save you money as your data cools off. We're going to automatically move it to cheaper storage. Let's see. I saw another question from James. I'm not sure if I understand your question, James. Feel free to unmute yourself if you'd like. Do you mean maybe I'll take a stab at it. So it's if there's already data in the volume it's in your performance tier, that's perfectly fine. It'll just start to cool at the point where you set the tiering policy, right? So if you had a volume with data on it, you're not currently using data tiering. If you then enable the tiering, the auto tiering policy, once your cooling period passes, then your data will start to move. Again, assuming that your aggregate is sufficiently full. Okay, that answered it. Brilliant. And actually, on a related note, the next tiering policy might actually help if you have an existing volume and you want to just go ahead and push all of that data into your capacity tier. So the backup tiering policy. This is the policy for people who just want to save money They don't access their data, just put all that stuff into the cheapest storage possible. We don't have video on, but I'm sure a bunch of heads just nodded in the audience. So the backup policy tiers all of your snapshots and your data immediately to the capacity tier. There is no cooling period, and that data actually doesn't even touch your EBS disks. The only thing we're going to use EBS disks for when the backup tiering policy is enabled is to store metadata. That just tells us how to retrieve the data from the capacity tier in the event that you should access it. So the backup tiering policy is a little bit different than the other two, and it can only be set on SnapMirror destinations or during a volume move operation. So, I mean, clearly here, if you have a backup strategy where you are maybe snap vaulting data from an on-premises data center into Cloud Volumes ONTAP, and that data is cold, you don't really expect to access it, this is the perfect tiering policy for you. Just when you create that SnapMirror relationship, and I can demo this, enable data tiering, and all of that data will immediately move to the capacity tier. Now keep in mind that in the event that you have a SnapMirror destination and that file system becomes active, you break that SnapMirror relationship, then your tiering policy will revert to the auto tiering policy. And I mentioned as well, you can also specify the backup tiering policy during a volume move operation. That's the only other time you can do so. That is a really useful tool if you find that you have an oversized aggregate or a volume that is on the performance tier and it just doesn't need to be. And then after that volume move operation is completed, again, the tiering policy on the volume will revert to auto. But keep in mind, all of the data is already on the capacity tier. We'll just be rehydrating that data as needed. You shouldn't expect data to come back into the performance tier unless you specifically access it. Cool. So I kind of spelled this out already, but obviously the backup tiering policy is a great choice for data that you're just not really going to access. If you just want a really simple, easy way to store data really cheaply using SnapMirror and using ONTAP, awesome. Use the backup tiering policy. Or like I said, it can be a tool that you use to shrink an oversized aggregate. We'll demo how that works and give you some instructions actually in the next section. Cool. So I feel like that was a lot of information. Like I said, that's the most important thing I wanted everybody to get out of this presentation. I will pause here for any other questions. All right, cool. I don't see anything coming through, so we'll keep moving. Like I said, I just have a couple of things that I wanted to put out there. I'm not really sure how to organize this information, so just going to stream of consciousness at you. So stuff that you need to know about data tiering that will come up, that will impact the way that you use this feature. Just know that cold data that is read sequentially can actually just be read straight from the capacity. And I think the biggest reason why I like to mention that is virus scanning, right? If you're doing virus scanning on a volume, then that's not going to be sufficient to bring it back into your performance tier. That'll stay in the capacity tier. Anytime data is read randomly or written to, then we definitely have to bring it back to the performance tier for that. And I said this earlier, but do keep in mind some latency will be introduced when you're moving data to the performance tier from the capacity tier. That's just kind of part of it. We have to move the data. It's not as fast as the data already being there. So do keep that in mind. Any workloads where even like a fraction of a millisecond of additional latency is unacceptable, probably not the best candidate for data tiering. Another important thing, I think I mentioned this earlier as well, but keep in mind, Cloud Manager will be provisioning object storage in your AWS or your Azure account for you. So you don't have to go and create an S3 bucket. You don't have to create a blob account. If you're used to using Fabric Pool, this is a little bit different, right? Because Fabric Pool with a with a physical device does actually require you to create your capacity tier manually. With Cloud Volumes ONTAP, you don't have to do that. And in fact, you can't do that. We can only use object storage that has been provisioned by Cloud Manager. Another thing to keep in mind is, it will be creating a bucket in your AWS or your Azure account, and you can see what's in that bucket. It's going to look like nonsense. It'll just be a ton of 20 megabyte encrypted files that you really can't do anything with. And it's really important that you don't actually do anything with those files. Do not mess with those buckets, just leave them. You can only mess things up by changing that data. One final note that's really good to know is we actually have a tool you can use to identify how much cold data is on your volumes. That's a link to the ONTAP 9 documentation. Very useful tool if you're just trying to get an idea of, hey, how much money can I save by using data tiering? All right, I'm going to pause actually before I get into this. I see we have another question. Any similarities to Storage Grid? Not really. Storage Grid can be a capacity tier with Fabric Pool if you're doing it from a physical ONTAP device. We don't support Storage Grid as a capacity tier for Cloud Volumes ONTAP. So it has to be an automatically provisioned bucket or a blob account. All right, cool. So I did mention, and I apologize that this slide is really wordy. This is just a really important thing I wanted everyone to know, and the best way to explain it is just to put it all out there. But if you do find yourself with an aggregate that's bigger than you want it to be, which is really easy to do, just imagine that you're using Cloud Volumes ONTAP, the amount of data that you initially put into the system, was say 50 terabytes. Maybe that data started tearing off and you only have 2 terabytes of hot data left, but you still have all of the drives that you needed to store that 50 terabytes of data in your performance tier provisioned, right? That situation happens all the time. But as you may know, aggregates for Cloud Volumes ONTAP are actually set up using RAID 0. So data is striped across them. You can't remove disks. Your only option here is actually to create a new aggregate and move your volume to the new aggregate. Now, a really nice thing about the volume move operation here is that is one of the few times when you can specify the backup tiering policy. So, if you're in a situation where an aggregate is too big or where you have a volume that you just want to force into the capacity tier, these instructions are what I recommend you do. Cool, so I'm going to kind of go through them and I will demonstrate them. Just let me know if you have any questions. So here's basically what you do. Create a new aggregate, and I should have specified you do this in Cloud Manager. Anytime that you're touching disks or needing to modify AWS or Azure resources for Cloud Volumes ONTAP, make sure you're using Cloud Manager. Only Cloud Manager has permission to add or remove disks from your AWS, your Azure account. So if you were to create an aggregate using System Manager, that aggregate wouldn't have any disks because System Manager doesn't have the permission to buy disks. Same thing in reverse, which is even more problematic. If you are trying to erase an aggregate and you do it from System Manager or the CLI, you're actually just going to strand those disks in your AWS account. And you'll have to open a support ticket to fix that, which is a hassle that nobody needs. I mean, we can obviously fix it, but it's better to avoid the problem entirely, in my opinion. Anyway, so here's the method for resizing an aggregate using a volume move operation. So create a new aggregate using Cloud Manager with the right number of disks for your use case. And if this is a cold storage situation where you're just not going to need to access this data, you can use one disk. That's perfectly fine. Not a big deal. So Once you've got your new aggregate created, you then use System Manager or the CLI. Unfortunately, we don't have this functionality in Cloud Manager to move your volume to the new aggregate. And during that volume move operation, you'll actually have the option to specify a tiering policy. Choose the backup one. That'll automatically put all that data into the capacity tier as the volume moves. Once the volume move is complete, feel free to delete that oversized aggregate using Cloud Manager. You'll do this through the advanced allocation menu. Like I said, I'll show this. Once the volume move is complete, that volume is actually going to revert to the auto tiering policy. Feel free to change the cooling period if you want. And data will move to the performance tier as it is accessed. That assumes you're going to access it. If you don't access it, it'll just stay in the capacity tier. And if this is a situation where you're trying to right-size an aggregate and you will be accessing that data, the aggregate should automatically grow to fit your data as needed. This does assume that you have automatic capacity mode enabled, which is the default, and you can change that in the Cloud Manager options. One note on this, if this is data that you're actually going to be using, you do want to make sure that you size that aggregate correctly. It will automatically grow, but keep in mind this is a RAID 0 group. So if you have specific performance requirements, you'll probably want to add the number of disks that you think is right. Anyway, then I give a link to Technical Report 4598, which is a fantastic guide to Fabric Pool. If you're interested in this, you really want to become an expert, I highly recommend